I should have listened to the warning. That's what I keep thinking now, sitting here with shaking hands trying to write this down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 days ago, I loaded my truck with camera gear and drove 8 hours into the Cascade Mountains. I'd been planning this trip for months. A photo series on abandoned structures, the kind of forgotten places that tell stories without words. The cabin rental seemed perfect. Remote enough that I wouldn't have tourists wandering into my shots, but close enough to several old mining sites and a defunct logging camp. The gravel road twisted through dense pine forest for what felt like forever. My GPS lost signal about 20 minutes back, but the property manager had given me good directions. Turn left at the lightning split oak, follow the creek bed, look for the red mailbox. I found the mailbox just as the sun started dropping behind the ridgeline. The driveway curved up through more trees, and then I saw the cabin. It was bigger than I'd expected from the photos online. 2 stories of dark wood with a wraparound porch and stone chimney. The kind of place that looked like it belonged here, like it had grown up from the forest floor instead of being built on top of it. A woman stood waiting by the front steps, mid-50s, maybe older, with gray hair pulled back and practical clothes that said she spent time outdoors. She watched me park and didn't smile when I got out. "Blake Lucas?" she called. "That's me." I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat. "You must be Savannah. Savannah Salinas." She walked over, keys in one hand and something else in the other. "How was the drive?" "Long, but worth it. This place is perfect." She didn't respond to that, just handed me the keys and held up what looked like an old notebook. Leather cover, worn smooth at the edges, held together with a piece of string. "Previous guests left this," she said. "You need to read it." I took the notebook and flipped it open. The first page had writing in blue ink, neat handwriting like someone had taken their time. "What is it?" "Rules." Savannah's voice was flat. "For staying here safely." I looked up at her. She wasn't smiling, wasn't joking. "Rules? Read them tonight. Follow them." She turned toward a beat-up Honda parked behind my truck. "I mean it. Wait, what kind of rules?" But she was already walking away. "Just read the notebook, Mr. Lucas, and take it seriously." She got in her car and drove off, leaving me standing there with a notebook full of rules and questions I couldn't ask. I carried my gear inside and got settled. The cabin was nice, clean, well-maintained, with a stone fireplace and big windows that looked out into the forest. I set up my equipment in the main room and made myself some dinner from the supplies I'd brought. Then I sat down with the notebook. The first page had 8 rules written in different colored inks, like different people had added them over time. The handwriting changed too. Some neat, some messy, one that looked like it was written in a hurry. Rule 1, in that careful blue ink: never photograph the stone circle behind the cabin. I stopped reading and looked out the back window. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but there was something back there worth not photographing. That didn't make sense. Rule 2, in black ink with looser handwriting: stay out of the woods between sunset and sunrise. Rule 3, green ink, block letters: keep all mirrors covered after dark. The rules got stranger from there. Something about not answering if you heard your name called from the forest. Don't leave food outside overnight. If you hear scratching on the walls, ignore it. And the last rule, written in red ink with handwriting that looked shaky: if red handprints appear on any windows, leave immediately and never return. I closed the notebook and laughed. I couldn't help it. This had to be some kind of local folklore thing. Small mountain towns loved their ghost stories and local legends. Probably helped bring in tourists looking for a spooky experience. The property manager was just playing her part, acting all serious about rules that were meant to add mystique to the place. I'd stayed in plenty of remote cabins before. The only real dangers were bears. Maybe a mountain lion if you were unlucky. Everything else was just stories people told to make boring places seem more interesting. Still, I was curious about that stone circle. The next morning I made coffee and explored the property. The cabin sat on about 5 acres of mixed forest, mostly pine and fir with some oak scattered through. A creek ran along the eastern edge, clear water running over smooth stones. Perfect for photos if the light was right. I walked around behind the cabin, following what might have been a path through the trees. The forest was quiet except for my footsteps on the pine needles and the distant sound of the creek. Then I saw them. 7 standing stones arranged in a perfect circle about 30 yards behind the cabin. Each one was maybe 8 feet tall, rough granite that looked like it had been here forever. But they weren't natural. Someone had placed them, arranged them with careful spacing, and someone had carved them. Each stone had symbols cut into the surface. Not deep, but deep enough that they'd lasted through however many years these things had been standing here. The symbols looked like handprints, but stylized, abstract. 5 fingers spread wide, carved into the gray stone. I walked around the circle slowly, studying each stone. The craftsmanship was incredible. Whoever had done this work knew what they were doing. The proportions were perfect, the spacing exact. It felt ancient, even though I knew it couldn't be that old. Native Americans in this area hadn't built stone circles like this. The light was perfect. Late afternoon sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows across the stones. The kind of dramatic lighting that made everything look mysterious and significant. I went back to the cabin and got my camera. Rule 1 said never photograph the stone circle. But that was just folklore nonsense, and this was exactly the kind of thing I'd come here to document. Forgotten structures with unknown histories. Places that made you wonder who had built them and why. I set up my tripod and started shooting. The stones looked even better through the lens, ancient and powerful, like they were holding some kind of energy in the space between them. I moved around the circle, getting different angles, playing with the shadows and the way the light hit the carved symbols. I must have taken 50 shots from outside the circle. Then I moved the tripod inside. The moment I stepped between the stones, the forest went quiet. Not gradually, all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. No birds, no insects, no sound except my own breathing. I looked up from the camera. The trees around the circle were still, no wind, no movement. Even the light seemed different, flatter somehow. I should have left then. Should have packed up my gear and walked back to the cabin. Instead, I kept shooting. I couldn't wait to see what I'd captured. Back at the cabin that evening, I hauled my portable darkroom setup down to the basement. The space was perfect for it. Cool, dry, no windows. I'd brought everything I needed. Enlarger, chemical trays, safe light, the works. This was the part I loved most about film photography. Digital was convenient, sure, but there was something about watching an image slowly appear in the developer that never got old. I set up the trays in order: developer, stop bath, fixer, mixed the chemicals to the right temperature. The familiar smell of the developer filled the small space. I'd shot 2 rolls out there, 36 frames total. Plenty to work with. The negatives went into the developer first. I rocked the tray gently, watching the timer. 4 minutes for the film I was using. When they were done, I held the strips up to the safe light. The images looked good, sharp, well exposed. The stone circle showed up clearly in each frame. Now came the real work. I loaded the first negative into the enlarger and projected it onto the easel. The composition looked solid. I'd captured the late afternoon light just right, the way it cut across those carved symbols. I slipped a sheet of photo paper under the enlarger and made my first test strip. 15 seconds seemed about right. Into the developer it went. The image started to appear almost immediately. First the outline of the stones, then the details of the carvings. But as the exposure continued to develop, I saw something that made me stop rocking the tray. There were people in the photograph. 7 figures stood between the stones. translucent, but clearly visible. They wore clothes from different time periods. I could make out what looked like a long dress from maybe the 1800s, a man's suit that seemed even older, work clothes that might have been from the early 1900s. Their faces weren't clear. The figures seemed to be looking toward where I'd been standing with my camera, but I couldn't make out features, just the suggestion of heads turned in my direction. I grabbed the tongs and pulled the print from the developer into the stop bath, then the fixer. My hands weren't quite steady. This had to be a mistake. Double exposure, maybe, or light leaks in the camera. I'd been careful loading the film, but mistakes happened. I tried the next negative. Same thing. 7 translucent figures standing between the stones in slightly different positions. And the next one. Same figures, but they'd moved. In this shot, they seemed closer to where I'd been standing. I developed 6 more prints. In every single one, the figures appeared, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. In one image near the end of the roll, they formed what looked like a semicircle around the spot where my tripod had been. I turned on the overhead light and spread the prints across the small table I'd set up. Under normal lighting, the figures were still there. Faint, but definitely present. This wasn't some trick of the safe light or my imagination. I checked my camera again. No obvious problems. The light seals looked fine. I'd loaded the film in my hotel room the night before I drove up here, not in bright sunlight or anything that would cause exposure issues. But people don't just appear in photographs, especially not translucent people wearing clothes from a century ago. I spent another hour in the darkroom, trying different exposure times, different contrast filters. Nothing changed. The figures remained in every single frame I'd shot, inside the stone circle. By the time I finished, it was past 11. I cleaned up the chemicals and headed upstairs, carrying the prints with me. I spread them out on the kitchen table under the bright overhead light. The figures were still there. I made coffee even though it was late. Needed something to do with my hands while I tried to think this through. There had to be a logical explanation. Film didn't lie, but it could be fooled. Chemical contamination, maybe, though I'd used these same chemicals on other shoots without any problems. I sat at the table staring at the images. The figures' postures suggested they were watching me, but their faces remained hidden in shadow, or simply too translucent to make out clearly. Something about their stance felt deliberate, like they'd positioned themselves specifically to be seen. The scratching started around midnight. At first, I thought it was branches against the cabin walls. The wind had picked up since I'd been in the basement, but the sound was too regular, too purposeful. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Then silence. Then it started again, somewhere else. I got up and moved to the living room window. Pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out. Nothing but darkness and trees. The scratching moved to the kitchen window. I walked over and peered through the glass. A pale handprint pressed against the window from outside. I jerked back from the glass. When I looked again, the handprint was gone. But now there was scratching at the front door. I grabbed a flashlight from my gear bag and went to the front window. Aimed the beam outside, sweeping it across the porch and yard. Nothing. Just my truck and the trees beyond. The scratching stopped. I waited by the window for maybe 10 minutes, but the sound didn't return. Whatever had been out there was gone now. Back in the kitchen, I looked at the photographs again. The translucent figures seemed to stare back at me from the prints. I thought about the notebook upstairs, those rules written in different hands. Rule 6. Ignore any scratching sounds on the cabin walls. Someone else had heard the same thing. The scratching started again around 1 in the morning, this time at the bedroom window upstairs. I'd brought the photographs up with me, spread them on the dresser where I could see them. I went to the window and looked out. Another handprint appeared on the glass, fingers spread wide. Then another one beside it, and another. The prints glowed faintly in the darkness, visible for maybe 30 seconds before fading away. They appeared and disappeared at different spots around the window, like someone was pressing their hands against the glass and pulling them away. I stepped back from the window. The scratching continued for another few minutes, then stopped. Rule 3 came back to me. Keep all mirrors covered after dark. I looked around the bedroom. There was a mirror above the dresser, another on the inside of the closet door. In the bathroom, a large mirror over the sink. This was crazy. I was a rational person. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but I'd seen those handprints with my own eyes, and the photographs didn't lie. I found some bedsheets in the closet and covered the bedroom mirror first, then the one in the bathroom. The closet door mirror was harder to manage, but I got a sheet draped over it and tucked the edges behind the frame. The scratching didn't return that night. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the photographs spread in front of me. In daylight, with birds singing outside and normal forest sounds, the whole thing seemed less threatening. But the figures in the photos were still there, still watching. I needed answers, and I knew where to find them. Cedar Falls was the nearest town, about 40 minutes down the mountain. I'd driven through it on my way up, but hadn't stopped. Small place, maybe 2,000 people, the kind of town that would have a library with local history resources. I loaded my camera bag and the photographs into the truck. The stone circle sat silent behind the cabin as I drove away. In the rearview mirror, I could see the tops of the standing stones through the trees. The Cedar Falls Library was a single-story brick building on the main street. Inside, an older woman with auburn hair and wire-rimmed glasses sat behind the circulation desk. She looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" "I hope so. I'm researching some local history, specifically about a stone circle formation up near the old mining area." Her expression shifted slightly. Not quite concern, but something close to it. "Are you the photographer staying at the Hendricks cabin?" "That's right, Blake Lucas." I wasn't surprised she knew. Small towns talked. "I'm Beverly Woods. I can help you with the historical research." She stood up from her desk. "Though I have to ask, you're not planning to disturb the site, are you?" "No, nothing like that. Just trying to understand what I'm looking at." Beverly led me to a back room lined with filing cabinets and shelves of bound volumes. Local newspapers, county records, historical society documents. "The stone circle predates European settlement," she said, pulling out several folders. "The formation itself is ancient, though we don't know exactly how old. Local tribes avoided the area, called it a place where the dead refused to rest." She set the folders on a small table. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" I thought about showing her the photographs, but something held me back. "Just general background. The formation is unusual. I'm curious about its history." Beverly opened the first folder. "The earliest written records are from the 1880s. A surveying expedition came through the area in 1887, led by a man named Richard Hernandez. They were mapping the region for potential railroad development." She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "The expedition disappeared, all 5 men. Their equipment was found scattered around the stone circle, but no trace of the men themselves." I leaned forward to read the article. The headline read, "Surveying Party Vanishes in Mountain Wilderness." What happened to them? "Nobody knows. Search parties combed the area for weeks. Found their horses, their surveying tools, even their personal belongings. But the men were never seen again." Beverly opened another folder. "There have been other incidents over the years. People going missing near the circle. Strange sightings. Most folks around here know to stay away from that area." She looked at me directly. "Especially after dark." I figured I'd stay busy, keep my hands and my mind occupied while I tried to make sense of what I'd found in those photographs. The forest around the cabin was full of other subjects anyway. Collapsed cabins, rusted mining equipment, the kind of abandoned structures I'd come here to document in the first place. so that's what I did for the next 3 days. I loaded my camera bag every morning and hiked through the woods, staying clear of the stone circle. I found plenty to shoot. An old logging cabin with its roof caved in, support beams jutting out at broken angles, a rusted ore cart sitting on twisted rails that disappeared under decades of pine needles, mining structures with wooden frames weathered gray and leaning like they might fall over if I breathed too hard. I worked methodically, the way I always did. Set up my tripod, checked the light, composed each shot carefully. The routine felt normal, safe even. Just me and the camera and the quiet work of documenting what time had left behind. But when I got back to the cabin each evening and developed the film, that's when things got worse. The first roll I shot after the stone circle contained 24 frames of the collapsed logging cabin I'd found about half a mile north of the property. I'd spent 2 hours there, working alone. The cabin was empty, just rotting floorboards and broken windows and that caved-in roof. I developed the negatives in the basement darkroom, same routine as before. Made my test strips, set my exposure times, slipped the first sheet of photo paper into the developer. The image came up clear and sharp. The cabin looked exactly like I remembered it, except for the figure standing in the doorway. A woman in a long dress from maybe the 1920s or 30s, her hair pinned back, her face pale but distinct. She stood right in the center of the empty doorframe, looking straight at the camera, looking straight at me. I stared at the print for a long time, then developed the next frame. Same cabin, different angle. The woman was still there, but she'd moved. Now she stood beside the collapsed roof beam, one hand resting on the broken wood. By the time I'd developed the whole roll, I'd counted 4 different figures. The woman in the 20s dress. An older man in work clothes that looked like they were from the 40s or 50s. A younger guy in what might have been 70s era flannel and jeans. And someone else, harder to make out, standing in the shadows near the back wall. None of them had been there when I took the pictures. I was sure of that. I'd spent 2 hours at that cabin, checking every angle, making sure no other hikers or explorers were around. The place was empty. But there they were in my photographs, clear as anything. I tried different film the next day, switched from my usual black and white to color, thinking maybe it was something about the chemistry. Found an old mine shaft entrance about a mile east, and spent the morning documenting the timber supports and rusted equipment scattered around the opening. Developed the color film that evening. Same thing, 3 figures this time, standing among the mining equipment. A man in 1880s clothing, suspenders, work shirt, hat, leaning against a rusted wheelbarrow. A woman in what looked like early 1900s dress standing beside the mine entrance. And another man, harder to date, wearing clothes that could have been from the 60s. I switched cameras the day after that. Used my backup 35mm instead of the medium format I'd been shooting. Documented a series of collapsed structures near the creek. Old wooden sluice boxes, the remains of what might have been a mill. Same result. More figures. Different time periods. Some I could identify by their clothing. Victorian era, early 20th century, mid-century modern. Others were harder to place, but they were all there, standing among the ruins, positioned like they belonged in the shots, and they were getting clearer, more solid-looking. The first photographs from the stone circle had shown translucent figures, barely visible. These new ones looked almost real. I could make out facial features, details in their clothing, the way they stood and held themselves. I counted them each night. 4 figures in the first roll after the stone circle, 3 in the second, 5 in the third, 6 in the fourth. The numbers kept growing, and not just because I was finding more structures to photograph. Sometimes the same location would show more figures when I shot it from different angles, like they were gathering there. That's when I remembered what Beverly had told me about Richard Hernandez's expedition, how they'd found the surveying equipment weeks after the men disappeared, how that equipment included camera gear. I drove back to Cedar Falls the next morning and found Beverly at the library again. She looked up from her desk when I walked in, and I could see she'd been expecting me. "You found something?" she said, not a question. "You mentioned Hernandez's camera equipment. Were there photographs?" Beverly nodded slowly. "Come on back." She led me to the same room where we'd looked at the newspaper clippings, pulled out a different folder. This one was thicker, older. She opened it carefully and spread out several documents on the table. "Search party found their gear 3 weeks after they went missing," she said. "Camera, tripod, glass plates. The plates had been exposed." She showed me photocopies of what looked like official reports, handwritten notes from the search team leader, and at the bottom of the stack, copies of the photographs themselves. I stared at them. 5 men in surveying clothes, standing among the stone circle. The image quality was different. This was 1880s photography, glass plates instead of film, but the composition was unmistakable. The men stood between the stones, their equipment visible around them. "The thing is," Beverly said quietly, "witnesses confirmed these pictures were taken after the men disappeared. The search party leader wrote it right here." She pointed to a line in the handwritten report. "Equipment found arranged as if in use. Plates exposed but no operator present." I read the report twice. The search team had found the camera set up on its tripod, pointed at the stone circle. The exposed plates showed Hernandez and his 4 men positioned among the stones, but the search party had been looking for those same men for 3 weeks. "They took their own pictures after they disappeared," I said. "That's what it looks like." I thought about my own photographs, the figures getting clearer, more solid-looking with each roll of film I developed, the way they seemed to be positioning themselves deliberately, like they wanted to be seen. "How many people have gone missing up there?" I asked. Beverly pulled out another folder. "Official records? 17 over the past 130 years. But there's probably more. Drifters, prospectors, people who came and went without anyone keeping track." I looked at the list she showed me. Names and dates going back to the 1880s. Richard Hernandez and his team in 1887. A family named Morrison in 1903. Individual names scattered through the decades. Miners, loggers, hikers, researchers like me. "The clothing?" I said. "In the photographs I've been taking, the figures are wearing clothes from different time periods." Beverly nodded. "Matches up with the disappearances, doesn't it?" I counted the names on her list. 17 official cases. But I'd been seeing more figures than that in my photographs. The most recent roll had shown 13 people standing in the doorway of that collapsed cabin. 13 figures in different clothing from different decades. I drove back to the cabin that afternoon with a sick feeling in my stomach. The routine felt different now. Loading film, checking equipment, setting up shots. It all felt like I was participating in something I didn't understand. Something that had been happening for over a century. But I kept shooting anyway. Part of me needed to document what I was seeing, even if I couldn't explain it. Part of me was afraid to stop, like breaking the routine might make something worse happen. That night I developed 2 rolls I'd shot near an old lumber mill foundation. The figures were even clearer now. I could make out individual faces, expressions, the specific details of their period clothing. A woman in 1890s dress, a man in 1920s work clothes, someone in what looked like 1950s casual wear. And they weren't just standing around anymore. They were looking directly at the camera. Some had their hands raised like they were trying to get my attention. Others pointed toward something outside the frame. I finished in the dark room around midnight and brought the prints upstairs, laid them out on the kitchen table under the bright overhead light. 24 photographs of abandoned structures, and every single one contained multiple figures that hadn't been there when I took the pictures. That's when I started hearing the voices. Quiet at first, just whispers around the edges of my hearing, like conversation in another room. I thought it might be wind in the trees, but there wasn't any wind that night. The air was completely still. I walked to the living room window and looked out at the forest. Nothing moved. The trees stood motionless in the moonlight, and I couldn't see any lights or signs of other people anywhere. But the whispers continued, coming from different directions now: the kitchen, the front porch, the upstairs bedroom. Voices talking in low tones, too muffled by the cabin walls for me to make out actual words. Men's voices and women's voices, some sounding older, others younger. I stood in the middle of the living room and listened. The voices seemed to move around the cabin, sometimes closer to the windows, sometimes farther away, like people were walking around outside, having conversations I couldn't quite hear. The whispers continued until almost dawn, then faded away as the sun came up. I woke to tapping sounds on the windows, light tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass, slow and deliberate. I'd been getting maybe 3 hours of sleep a night since the voices started, so it took me a minute to figure out what I was hearing. The tapping moved. Started at the bedroom window, then shifted to what sounded like the kitchen downstairs, then back up to the bathroom window. I sat up in bed and checked my watch. 3:27 a.m. The notebook sat on my nightstand where I'd been reading it every night, trying to find something I'd missed, some explanation for what was happening to my photographs. But I knew what this was: Rule 8, written in shaky red ink. If red handprints appear on the windows, leave immediately. Do not pack. Do not hesitate. Go. I pulled back the bedroom curtain. Red handprints covered the entire window. Dozens of them, overlapping and pressed against the glass from outside. They looked fresh, like someone had just dipped their hands in paint and slapped them against the window. The prints varied in size, some small like a child's hands, others large with long fingers. I stumbled backward and knocked into the dresser. The tapping continued downstairs. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the kitchen window, pulled back those curtains too. More red handprints. These covered the glass so completely I couldn't see through to the forest beyond. The prints seemed to shimmer in my flashlight beam, and when I got closer, I could feel warmth coming through the glass. I moved to the living room windows. Same thing. Red handprints pressed against every piece of glass, some overlapping others, creating layers of red that pulsed like they had their own heartbeat. The front door had a window, too. I checked it and found handprints there as well, but these looked different, larger. The fingers stretched longer than any human hand should reach. I should have grabbed my keys and left right then. Rule 8 was clear about that. Don't pack, don't hesitate, just go. But I'd been a photographer for 12 years, and I'd never seen anything like this. I went back upstairs and got my camera. The handprints were still there, still warm against the glass. I loaded a fresh roll of film and adjusted my camera settings for the low light. The red seemed to glow on its own, so I didn't need the flash. I started with the bedroom window, taking several shots of the overlapping prints. Through the viewfinder, I could see them more clearly. Some prints had all 5 fingers spread wide. Others were missing fingers or had extra ones. A few looked like they'd been smeared across the glass while the paint was still wet. But it wasn't paint. I was sure of that now. I moved to the kitchen and photographed those windows. As I worked, I noticed something strange. The handprints seemed to respond to the camera. When I focused on one section of glass, the prints in that area pulsed brighter. When I moved to a different window, new prints appeared while I was setting up the shot. At the living room windows, I watched a small handprint materialize right in front of me. It pressed against the glass from outside, the red spreading from the palm outward to the fingertips. Then another appeared next to it. Then 3 more. I kept photographing. The prints multiplied as I worked, spreading across the glass like living things. They moved, too, some sliding down the window while others appeared higher up. It was like watching something grow. The tapping had stopped, but now I could hear breathing outside. quiet but coming from multiple sources around the cabin. Some sounded like children, others like adults with labored, wheezing breaths. I finished the roll and loaded another one. The handprints now covered every visible surface of glass, layered so thick they blocked out the night completely. When I pressed my palm against the kitchen window from inside, I could feel warmth and what felt like pressure pushing back. I took the second roll of film downstairs to my dark room in the basement. My hands shook as I set up the chemical trays and turned on the red safe light. I needed to see what the camera had captured. I needed to understand what was happening. But when I turned on the safe light, I froze. Every photograph I'd developed over the past 10 days was glowing. The prints I'd hung to dry, the ones stacked on my work table, the contact sheets I'd made, all of them gave off the same red light as the handprints upstairs. I picked up one of the stone circle photographs. The image pulsed with red light that seemed to come from within the paper itself. The 7 figures I'd captured were still there, but now they looked different, more solid, more real. I grabbed another print from the collapsed cabin series. Same thing. The figures in period clothing glowed with red light, and their faces were clearer now. I could make out individual features, expressions, even the texture of their old-fashioned clothes. My hands shook as I went through the photographs. Every single image with figures in it was glowing. The red light was strongest around the figures themselves, outlining them like they were burning from the inside. I started developing the new film, the shots I'd just taken of the handprints. But as I worked, I kept glancing at the glowing photographs. Something was wrong with them beyond the light. I held up the first stone circle print and looked closer. There was an 8th figure in the image now. Standing among the 7 translucent figures, wearing modern clothes, jeans, hiking boots, a fleece jacket, the same clothes I was wearing right now. It was me. I grabbed another stone circle photograph. Same thing. I was standing inside the circle with the other figures, but I looked different, translucent, like them. The red light outlined my form just like it did theirs. I went through every stone circle photograph I'd taken. In each one, I appeared more ghostly. My modern clothes seemed to fade, becoming less distinct. In the last few prints, I was barely more solid than the historical figures around me. My breathing got shallow. I set down the photographs and stepped back from the table. The new film finished developing. I hung the negatives to dry and made contact sheets of the handprint photographs. Under the red safe light, the images looked normal. Just red handprints on glass. But when I made the first enlargement and put it in the developer, I watched something impossible happen. The handprints in the photograph moved. They slid across the paper as the image developed, rearranging themselves into new patterns. Some prints faded away while others appeared in empty spaces. The red grew brighter and darker in waves, like the prints were breathing. I developed 6 more enlargements. In each one, the handprints formed different configurations. Some spelled out shapes I couldn't identify. Others seemed to point toward something outside the frame. But in the last photograph, the one I'd taken of the front door window, the handprints had arranged themselves into letters. They spelled out my name. I stared at the photograph as the chemicals finished working. My name, spelled in red handprints across the glass. Blake. Clear as anything. I felt it happening in the dark room. My body was getting lighter, like someone was slowly turning down the weight of everything that made me real. I looked down at my hands holding the photograph of my name spelled out in red handprints, and I could see through them to the enlarger beneath. The red glow from all my photographs was getting brighter. Every image I'd developed over the past 10 days pulsed with that unnatural light, and the figures inside them looked more solid than I did. I set the handprint photo down on the developer tray and watched my fingers pass through the paper's edge like it wasn't there. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things worked. I pressed my palm against the dark room wall and felt resistance, but not the solid thunk of wood and insulation. More like pushing against thick water. The sensation sent panic through whatever was left of my nervous system. Above me, the tapping on windows had turned into something else. A drumming sound, fast and urgent, like dozens of hands beating against glass. The breathing sounds grew louder too. I could hear them through the basement ceiling now, wheezing and gasping from all directions around the cabin. I grabbed the stone circle photographs from the drying line. In each one, the eighth figure, me, looked more transparent than before. In the first photo, I appeared almost normal. By the sixth photo, I was barely an outline. The 7 historical figures, meanwhile, had become completely solid. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were real. And I was becoming the ghost. The realization hit me like cold water. The stone circle wasn't just some supernatural curiosity. It was a trap. A prison designed to catch souls and hold them. Everyone who disappeared over the past 130 years. They hadn't just vanished. They'd been photographed, captured, stored. My camera had been the conduit. Every time I'd taken a picture inside that circle, it had pulled a piece of my essence into the spiritual realm and pushed it into the photographs. The more I'd shot, the more I'd transferred from the physical world into those images. The figures in my other photographs, the ones at the collapsed cabins and mining sites, they weren't just appearing in my pictures. They were using my pictures as doorways, ways to move between their prison and the physical world. I looked at my hands again. They were getting more transparent by the minute. The drumming upstairs intensified. Through the basement ceiling, I heard wood creaking under pressure. The handprints weren't just covering the windows anymore. They were pushing against them, trying to break through. I had to move fast. I gathered all the photographs from the drying line, the ones spread across the work table, the enlargements still sitting in chemical baths. My hands passed through some of them twice before I got a grip. Everything felt like trying to grab smoke. The stone circle photos, the cabin series, the mining equipment shots, every single image that contained figures. I stuffed them into the empty film boxes and chemical containers, anything that would hold them. The photographs felt heavier than they should, like they contained actual weight from the souls trapped inside. I grabbed the negatives too. All the strips hanging from clips, the ones stored in sleeves, the undeveloped rolls still in their canisters. If the photographs were doorways, the negatives were the original keys. My arms were getting hard to control. When I tried to pick up a box of prints, my fingers went through the cardboard twice before solidifying enough to grip it. I was running out of time. I climbed the basement stairs, carrying everything I could manage. Each step took effort, like walking through mud. The drumming on the windows was constant now, accompanied by scratching sounds that moved across the walls in patterns. In the living room, I could see the windows were completely covered with red handprints, layer upon layer of them, so thick the glass looked like it was painted with blood. Some of the prints were moving, sliding across the surface, rearranging themselves into new configurations. I dropped the boxes of photographs by the fireplace and grabbed matches from the mantel. My fingers went through the matchbox twice before I managed to pick it up. The scratching sound stopped. Everything went quiet except for my breathing, which I could barely hear anymore. I struck a match. The flame looked normal, solid, real. More real than anything else in the room, including me. I touched the match to the corner of a stone circle photograph. The paper caught immediately, burning faster than normal film should burn. The flame was bright white instead of orange, and as the image dissolved, I felt something shift in my chest. A pulling sensation, like part of me was being drawn back into my body. The handprints on the nearest window faded slightly. I grabbed more photographs and fed them to the flames. The collapsed cabin series, the mining equipment shots, every image that contained figures. The fire consumed them eagerly, burning with that same bright white light. With each photograph that turned to ash, I felt more solid. My hands became opaque again. The pulling in my chest intensified, like my soul was being reeled back in on a fishing line. The handprints on all the windows were fading now, not disappearing completely, but losing their bright red color, turning pale pink and then barely visible. I burned the negatives next. They melted instead of burning, dissolving into chemical-smelling smoke that made my eyes water. But every strip that disappeared made me feel more anchored to the physical world. The drumming stopped entirely. I fed the last of the stone circle negatives into the flames. As they melted away, the pulling sensation in my chest reached a peak, like something had snapped back into place. I looked down at my hands, and they were completely solid again. Real. Mine. Through the windows, I could see outside for the first time in hours. The handprints were gone, leaving the glass clear and normal. And beyond the trees, where the stone circle had stood for over a century, I saw something that made me stop breathing. The stones were crumbling, all 7 of them, collapsing in on themselves like they were made of sand instead of granite. In the moonlight, I watched the ancient monoliths that had trapped souls for generations turn to rubble and dust. The last of the photographs curled into ash in the fireplace. The flames died down to normal orange embers. Outside, where the stone circle had been, nothing remained but a patch of disturbed earth and scattered rock fragments. I sat down hard in the nearest chair, feeling the solid weight of my body against the cushions. Real. Physical. Alive. The prison was broken. The souls were free. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Just sat in that chair watching the ash settle in the fireplace and checking the windows every few minutes to make sure they stayed clear. When the first light started showing through the trees, I knew I had to get out of there. Fast. I went upstairs and threw my clothes into my duffel bag. Didn't fold anything, just stuffed it all in. My hands were still shaking a little, but they were solid hands now. Real hands that could grab things and zip zippers. The darkroom equipment took longer. I had to drain the chemical trays and pack everything back into the cases. The enlarger broke down into 3 pieces that fit in the big case. I wrapped the timer and safe light in towels and shoved them into another box. My camera sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it the night before. I picked it up and looked at it for a long minute. This thing had almost cost me everything. Almost turned me into one of those trapped souls wandering around in photographs forever. I left it sitting there on the table. The truck started on the first try, which felt like a small miracle. I loaded my gear in the back and slammed the tailgate shut. The cabin looked normal in the morning light. Just a regular rental property with a wraparound porch and stone chimney. You'd never know what had happened here. I didn't look toward where the stone circle used to be. Didn't want to see that empty patch of disturbed earth and scattered rocks. Some things you don't need to confirm twice. The driveway curved down through the trees, same as when I'd arrived 5 days ago. Felt like 5 years. The red mailbox came into view, and then I was back on the dirt road following the creek bed toward the main highway. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but nothing followed me. Just trees and morning shadows getting smaller behind the truck. The GPS picked up signal about 20 minutes later, right where it had cut out on the way in. The little blue dot appeared on the screen showing my location, and I felt something loosen in my chest. I was back in the normal world now. The world where electronics worked and stones stayed put and photographs only showed what was actually there when you took them. The highway stretched out ahead of me, 2 lanes of cracked asphalt heading down the mountain. I rolled the windows down and let the cold air blow through the cab. It felt good to breathe air that didn't smell like chemicals or carry whispers on the wind. About an hour down the mountain, I saw a roadside diner with a gravel parking lot and a neon sign that said, Millie's, open 24 hours. I pulled in and parked next to a semi-truck. My hands had stopped shaking completely, but I still needed coffee and a few minutes to figure out what I was going to tell Savannah. The diner had red vinyl booths and a counter with chrome stools. I sat in a corner booth and ordered coffee and eggs from a waitress who looked like she'd been working the morning shift for about 30 years. The coffee was strong and hot, and the eggs came with hash browns and toast that actually tasted like food. I pulled out my phone and found Savannah's number. She answered on the third ring. "Blake? Everything all right up there?" "I'm heading out early," I said. "Had some equipment problems, going to cut the trip short." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not hurt?" "No, just ready to go home." "Good," she said. "That's good. I'll adjust the rental charges. You don't owe anything extra." "Thanks." "Blake?" "Yeah?" "You read that notebook?" I looked out the diner window at my truck. The leather notebook sat on the passenger seat where I'd put it before leaving the cabin. I read it. "Then you understand why I don't ask questions about early departures." "I understand." She hung up without saying goodbye. I finished my eggs and paid the check. The waitress told me to drive safe, and I told her I would. Back in the truck, I put the notebook in the glove compartment and headed for the interstate. The drive home took 8 hours, same as the drive up. But this time I had the radio on and the windows cracked and no expectations about what I might find at the end of the road, just my apartment and my regular life and commercial photography jobs that paid the bills. I kept thinking about those 7 figures I'd seen in the first photographs. People who'd probably come to that place for their own reasons. Maybe some of them had been photographers too. Maybe they'd seen those carved stones and thought they'd make interesting subjects. Maybe they'd all ignored the rules in that notebook. The notebook stayed in the glove compartment during the drive, but I could feel it there, like a weight pressing against my leg every time I shifted in the seat. When I got home, I carried it upstairs to my apartment and put it on my desk next to my computer. The leather was soft and worn, and the string that held it together was frayed at the ends. I opened it and read through the 8 rules again. Never photograph the stone circle behind the cabin. Stay out of the woods between sunset and sunrise. Keep all mirrors covered after dark. Don't answer if your name is called from the forest. Don't leave food outside overnight. Ignore any scratching sounds on the cabin walls. If you hear whispers, stay inside until dawn. If red handprints appear on windows, leave immediately without packing. 8 rules written by different people over the years. People who'd learned the hard way what could happen if you didn't follow them. I closed the notebook and left it on the desk. The next few days I spent catching up on work emails and editing photographs from jobs I'd shot before the mountain trip. Regular stuff. Corporate headshots and product photography and a wedding that had been scheduled for months. Normal pictures that showed exactly what had been in front of the camera when I pressed the shutter. I tried looking up the cabin online to see if I could find any mention of the stone circle or the disappearances Beverly had told me about. But there wasn't anything. No reviews mentioning supernatural activity, no local news stories about missing people, no historical articles about ancient stone formations. The cabin wasn't listed on any of the rental sites anymore either. The property management company's website still existed, but when I searched for the address, nothing came up, like the place had just vanished from the internet. Maybe that was for the best. I went back to work the following week, had a shoot for a tech company that needed product photos for their website. Simple stuff. Set up the lights, arrange the products, check the exposure, take the shots. The kind of photography I could do in my sleep. But I found myself being more careful now. Double-checking my camera settings, making sure I knew exactly what was in the frame before I pressed the shutter, looking at the developed images more closely to confirm they matched what I remembered seeing. The notebook stayed on my desk at home. Sometimes I'd flip through it before bed, reading the rules and thinking about the people who'd written them, wondering how many others had stayed at that cabin over the years and learned the same lessons I'd learned. I started covering my bathroom mirror at night. Just pulled a towel over it before I brushed my teeth. seemed like a reasonable precaution. The rule had kept me safe up there, and habits like that don't hurt anything in the city. A month later, I got a call from a magazine that wanted to hire me for a photo essay about abandoned buildings in the Southwest. Good money, and the kind of artistic work I'd gone to the mountains to do in the first place. I turned it down. The editor seemed surprised, asked if I was sure, because the assignment was right up my alley based on my portfolio. I told him I was focusing on commercial work for the foreseeable future. He said to call him if I changed my mind. I won't be calling him back. The notebook sits on my desk now as I write this. A reminder of how close I came to ending up like those other people. Trapped in photographs, trying to warn the next person who might make the same mistakes. I still do photography, still make a good living at it, but I stick to studios and offices and controlled environments where I know exactly what's in front of my camera. No more isolated locations. No more ancient structures. No more taking pictures of things I don't understand. Some discoveries aren't worth making.